You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
He was present on the battlefield at Gettysburg, and he lives long enough to be hit by an automobile. Think about that. I find A.B. Farquhar very interesting because he was one of Grover Cleveland's supporters, but he's also a man who knew Lincoln. He wrote a book called The First Million is the Hardest. As he writes in his memoir, York, Pennsylvania was his hometown and where he made his fortune in a manufacturing business that exported around the world. York was northern, he said, but not anti-Southern. It was an anti-slavery town, but not radical or abolitionist, not fanatical as he described it. But most people in York were of the opinion that all new states formed from territories should be free. And he liked Lincoln. Only a very few people held him as a potentially great man, not a larger number than hail every president as great, but his speeches and declarations affected me deeply, more deeply than I can well describe. They awoke in me an admiration which a few years later, after I had met and talked with him, developed into a reverence that has grown with the years. Today, after having met many of the leading men in most of the countries of the world during the past half century, I believe that he was one of the few supermen. This may sound extravagant, but I cannot put down my feeling towards Abraham Lincoln in less emphatic terms. When the most has been said that can be said, only a fraction of the whole man has been revealed. When came the declaration and the inauguration, I was within a few feet of the platform, closely watching his face. I knew that he meant what he said, that his promises would be kept, that he had no purpose of interfering with the institution of slavery in the states where it existed, that he was against bloodshed and violence, that he would protect the integrity of the Union. We thought that the genius and firmness of Lincoln would find a way out. Those who live today have no conception of the obstacles which the Union had already surmounted in its organization. I was a young man with little personal experience, but all around were men who had gone through the travel of the Union. They had seen basic points of difference between the sections reconciled. Politics were usually violent. In most disputes, each side held as course that the other was actuated by lower motives than had hitherto been in history of the human mind. And that, as far as personal character was concerned, one would have to go back to the worst of the Roman empires, even to get a faint idea of the moral turpitude of the opponent. We were accustomed to violent invective, and seldom an election passed without a number of free-for-all fights. What today we would call shocking vituperative campaign would have then been classified as mild. Farquhar talks about York during the Civil War. Business drops dead. Everyone starts to drill. They join the army if they can. Banks closed. They stopped hard money payments. Stocks and merchandise sold at almost any price that was offered so that men could have the money they needed to go and fight. They needed hard currency in order to start regiments and get all the equipment so that they could present themselves well and fight. Lincoln's proclamation after Sumter called for men from 18 to 45. Most of the men who came out were under 21. There was no idea in the beginning that the country was in a fight for its life. Married men, like myself, did not serve, nor were they expected to. Now, A.B. Farquhar does a lot of business in the South, and this aroused suspicion in his town. He buys a substitute and joins a home cavalry guard in the local area of York, Pennsylvania. The new Confederate government announces that the debts of Northerners by Southerners were null and void. Instead, they say, helpfully, just pay the Confederate Treasury for anything you owe those Yankees. Some bills, though, were still paid, Farquhar says. Through Canada, there was a kind of a clearinghouse developed where some of his bills. He made sure he was paying suppliers that he owed in the South, and once in a while he would get paid too, and after the war he mostly got paid for his debts. Again, from the first million is the hardest. Farquhar, 1922, I should say, is when this book comes out. Business dropped dead. Everybody started to drill. It was not that the men were unwilling to fight, far from that, but there was no idea in the beginning that the country was to fight for its life. The first call for only 75,000 men to serve 3 months was an indication of the official view that that's all that they would need. We were generally concerned with the quick punishment of Americans who had dared to fire upon the Stars and Stripes than we were with getting ready for a civil war. That was still inconceivable. Indignation superseded preparation. I was a strong Union sympathizer, but I had been born and educated south of the Mason-Dixon line, had many relatives there, and did most of my business there. The cheery confidence of the opening days evaporated in the Battle of Bull Run. As the Confederate Army slowly fought their way north in their campaign, they actually crossed the Pennsylvania border, and we feared were marching towards York. Our people were very much disturbed. Valuables were sent away where practicable, and some citizens left. As the troops came nearer, our local volunteer emergency cavalry company was sent out. The Confederates were reported to be 30 miles off. Okay, so he's one of the local cavalry here. The committee was discussing plans for the safety of the citizens and the property of the town when I entered the meeting and proposed that it would be well to meet the Confederates before they entered the town, that we could make a good deal better bargain with them than we could after, when they saw how little of our property we had been able to remove to a place of safety. The town attorney said my plan would be good enough if anyone could find to go. We would make any bargain, and if the Confederates would keep the bargain, it would be great. I told him I would go, and I believed I could make an arrangement. I was certain they would keep faith. My plan, however, was not seriously entertained. Then I told them I would take the responsibility of going anyhow, even if the committee didn't send me. I hitched up my buggy and started off. I struck the Confederate lines beyond Abbottstown, 18 miles from York, and was fortunate in meeting an old classmate, Lieutenant Reddick from Georgia. I had not seen him since school days. He greeted me with the words, "Hello, Farquhar, what are you doing up here among the Yankees?" I replied, "I came just to find out what are you doing here among the Yankees. I have some property in York, and I don't want it burnt. Who's in command?" "General Gordon," he answered, whom you may know, and General Early. I asked him to put somebody else in charge of his company, jump into the buggy with me, and we would go see Gordon, which he did. The general was very courteous. I did not know General Gordon personally, but I knew him well through mutual friends. And having stated exactly the object of my mission, I said, "General Gordon, unless you have entirely changed from the character you used to have, you are neither a horse thief nor a bank robber, and fighting is more in your line than sacking a city." He evidently knew what I had in mind and smiled. He asked me what I would have him do, and I said to the general, "You and your men enter York quietly, and then you sit down and make requisitions for whatever you reasonably want, and our committee will see that they are honored." He said he would be more than glad to do that. The men in the valley have not been kind to us, but Lee is not apt to retaliate, the general said. So he comes back and tells the Committee of Safety in the town of York what he heard. "It's too good to be true," some of the others say. So now members of the committee go along with Farquhar and again go through the lines and talk to General Gordon again. This time, Farquhar, with all of these townspeople of York with him, finds the general to be a bit more formal than the personal exchange he had had with him. But now there's more witnesses, and he generally agrees to the same thing. "10 o'clock the next morning, some cavalry came in, some bugles were sounded, and the Stars and Stripes were taken down from the center of the town of York, and the stars and bars were raised. The infantry came later, with General Jubal Early. He goes to the courthouse, and he has his requisition now ready. The amount was perhaps more staggering than expected: 165 barrels of flour, 28,000 pounds of baked bread, 3,500 pounds of sugar, 1,600 pounds of coffee, 300 gallons of molasses, 1,200 pounds of salt, 32 pounds of either fresh beef, or if not available, 21,000 pounds of bacon or pork. Also, 2,000 boots, 1,000 socks, and 1,000 hats made of felt. Also, 100,000 in U.S. currency. Now, it was impossible even for relatively wealthy York with its industrial capacity to provide all of this just on hand. They convince Early that, first of all, with the money, $100,000 U.S. is worth about $10,000 in Confederate money. And that's what they really should pay then, $10,000. They work out a number of $28,000. And they provide as much of the other materials as they can. Now, at a certain point, it's taking more time to provide these supplies, and Early starts to threaten that he's going to destroy things in town. He's going to start setting fires. However, his lieutenants go to Farquhar and say that this is essentially, don't worry about this. This is more of a threat. The general's not going to do this. They provide what they can. They provide a bill, an invoice. That's never going to be collected, of course. It takes time. But York is unharmed. And soon, his troops need to head back to the town of Gettysburg to help Lee there. Farquhar also gets over to the Gettysburg battlefield to help with the hospital service. Guys, it's summer. Let's go shopping at Quince. Every summer, I like to do something a little different. I like to get a new polo shirt. I'm not getting a whole new wardrobe, but a new polo shirt. This year, it's the solid deep navy flow knit breeze performance polo. It's cool, it's comfortable, and it's from Quince. They also have heather ocean navy, olive, true black, and then there's heather dewstone blue, lighter blue. Personally, I like that with like a brown slack or a dark gray slacks. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They work directly with ethical factories and cut out the middlemen. So you're paying for exceptional quality. You're not paying for brand markup. I like my flow knit polo. I think you'll like what you purchased too. Make your summer wardrobe easier. Go to quince.com/myhist for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/myhist, MYHIST, for free shipping and 365 days returns. Quince.com/myhist. Now, you see where we are here. He has saved the town. In his view, he's the savior of the town. He doesn't necessarily want credit, but he doesn't like the reaction he's about to get. In some ways, we could think of this, and in the middle of a civil war, when you're being invaded, your job is to fight the enemy. He provided the enemy with quarter, the exact opposite. On the other hand, he also saved a destruction that, in his view, as a businessman, costs a lot of money. I expected to share the joy of the Confederates being turned back after Gettysburg when I came home, but I noticed people in York pointing at me and jeering, calling me a rebel. At first, I couldn't make out what this was all about. Then I realized that the people who I called the pinchbeck patriots, who had not come out of their houses during the whole emergency, now decided that our committee of safety had not saved the town, but had sold out the town. And I was the man who had started it all, who was behind it all, the ringleader, something near being called a traitor without anyone using those words. I shall never forget those days, being passed as the man who sold York, Pennsylvania. It was unjust, but my indignation knew no bounds. I went to Washington. I talked over the whole matter with the president's secretary, young John Hay, later our able Secretary of State, whom I knew personally. He declared that I had done exactly right and deserved condemnation, but he tried to persuade me not to insist on seeing the president to get that confirmed. He said he was overworked and very much worried. But on second thoughts told me the president would leave the front door of the White House at 4:30 to go to the War Department and meet some officers, and I could walk with him without taking up any of his time. I took my position on the front portico of the White House, which I noticed particularly needed paint. There were no guards or soldiers about, and no flunkies or attendants. Several generals passed to and fro while I was there, but there was nothing to prevent anyone from going by the East Room right to the president's office. And exactly at 4:30, the president came out. Since I had seen him at his first inauguration, his face had grown sadder, but his eye even more kindly. And he had taken on a kind of simple, majestic dignity that seemed more of the soul of the person, a dignity and majesty that one felt rather than saw. No painting, no statue, no attempt at recreation of him on stage has ever given even a suggestion of this surrounding quality, of this atmosphere that came from him and lifted him away from the rut of ordinary mortals. I was almost overcome with a feeling of reverence at the sight of him. He asked as we shook hands, "Well, Sonny, what are you after?" He did not smile, but he took my hand in his great, strong palm, placed the other on my shoulder, and looked down into my face. And then I told, or maybe blurted out, my whole story. He said nothing at all, and when I had finished, he started on his way. I fell in beside him, answering his inquiring look with, "I am going with you, Mr. President. I want your advice and to know what you think of our action." Thus we walked together, although it took 2 of my steps to match his stride. He shambled just a little, as might a man who is not wholly conscious that he has a body. But I remember that he was very clean, and so was his clothing, although it hung loose and ill-fitting about him. He wore a soft black slouch hat. Some pictures give the idea that Lincoln was ungainly. His hands and feet were large, but not ungainly. Not a motion was ungraceful. Great and strong and rugged he was, with the greatness and strength and ruggedness of the glorious live oak. As we walked, he asked me questions. Was I married? Did I have any children? Had I a business in York? What kind was it? Was it prosperous? And thus we walked up to the steps to the War Department building and through to a room where already together were the Secretary of War Stanton and perhaps a dozen generals. Stanton was personally known to me, my cousin James Howell being his private secretary. I had met him several times. The president, giving my hand a squeeze, brought me before the secretary and said, "Stanton, I have captured that young chap who sold York, Pennsylvania to the rebels. What are we going to do with him?" Well, the secretary answered him just as gravely, "Him? We ought to promote him." And then he went on to say that my actions saved some millions dollars worth of property, probably saved at a trifling cost. "You were wise," the president said, "not to neglect an opportunity to be of service. Opportunity does not knock at a man's door every day. The mistake you made was in worrying yourself over what people say about you. You should go through life doing what you believe and not bother yourself over what people might say. They will soon forget their criticisms. The place for you, Lincoln said, is in the Army. It's a place I should love to take myself. I'll follow you up and see that you get a chance for promotion. The mustering officer is right here. Now, Farquhar, imagine getting this statement from Lincoln from Abraham Lincoln that you get to carry through your entire life, right? You should go through your life doing what you believe to be right and not bother yourself over what people may say. You're going to remember something like that. Farquhar already was a kind of person who had that attitude, but it's interesting to get, confirmation from Abraham Lincoln. Now, in terms of this offer to join the Army, Farquhar says, I told him that the situation at home with my family and my business would make that all but impossible for me. As things were, I felt that I could be of more service at home. I told him that I had served with the emergency men at Gettysburg and furnished a substitute. He smiled gently as he answered, Being married is no excuse, but you, maybe, are contributing your mite, and that is all any of us can do. I wish my might could be spelled M-I-H-G-T, M-I-G-H-T, I answered. Lincoln didn't miss a beat, apparently, reading his biography here. He says, might is made up of mites, so what is the difference? Our aim in life should be to leave a world a mite better than we found it. You can go home and tell them what I have said to you. Tell them that you have my thanks and the thanks of the government. Fortunately, he didn't have to do that because no one would believe him, but the news of his interview had preceded me, and he was received, he says, and he was received cordially when he gets back home to York, and never again heard about having sold out the city. The next time I saw Lincoln was just before the marvelous Gettysburg speech. A small party of us drove up to Gettysburg early in the morning, and just as Lincoln was mounting his horse from Lawyer Will's home, where he stopped to ride up to Cemetery Hill, I had the chance to shake hands with him. He remembered me and spoke a half-joking word or two. He had become graver than when I had seen him in Washington. The terrific strain that he had been under showed in the deepening lines in his face and the abyss of sadness in his eyes. Time has idealized the president. For me, he never needed idealization. But for those that knows only the days of the Civil War from books, can have but little realization of the tense political struggles that were taking place in the North, of the personal opposition to the president on the part of the extreme abolitionists on one hand and the Copperheads on the other, and of the movement led by the Tribune among them to force him out. They wanted to displace Lincoln with somebody else, whose sole thought would be abolishing slavery rather than the saving of the Union. This is Farquhar speaking. The Gettysburg and Vicksburg victories immensely helped the president, but they by no means silenced the attacks against him. There was not a general slogan of stand behind the president in those days. He talks about standing near Lincoln when he makes the speech at Gettysburg. It was over so quickly, it was so direct, so simple, so forceful, that practically none of those in the audience seemed to realize they just heard the most glorious joining of word and thought that has ever come from mortal man. Edward Everett, who spoke before Lincoln and gave a multiple hour-long speech, while Lincoln gives one of a few minutes, says, Mr. President, you have made a great speech. My address will be remembered only because it was made on the same day. The president answered, the audience does not seem to agree with you. And Farquhar says the audience certainly did not. They did not really know what they had heard. When a great thing happens, those who are there rarely have any notion of the greatness. The Tribune said that the president had made a few remarks, and a Harrisburg paper, published the next morning, spoke sneeringly of it as being unworthy of the president. Yes, that paper called it dishwat, like dishwater speech. And actually, 100 years later, more than 100 years later, the paper apologized. About a year later, I spoke at an agricultural meeting in Elkton, Maryland. I spoke to Horace Greeley about this, and he gruffly answered, one of the many times we were damn fools, and I told him I forgave him. Now, he's writing in 1922, so I want to read this portion of his account and leave you with this. The business conduct of the Civil War was not without its dark side. While, of course, there were many who would scorn to enrich themselves by taking advantage of the government's necessities during the cruel strain of war, it is nevertheless notoriously true that the vultures gather where there is a chance for good pickings. And it was true of the Civil War, just as has been true of nearly all wars. In a number of cases, an account of the people who sold supplies to the government during the Civil War would be little better than a record of crime. When I compare the record, then, with the record of the present, it is to draw from that comparison a picture of the increase in business honesty that has come about in the years. In the World War, and this is what he says, he's writing in 1922, in the World War, we made many mistakes. Many things cost the government much more than they should have cost, but a small minority of those who sold to the government were shameless profiteers, and still fewer tried to impose bad goods. Nearly everyone who made anything for the government during the World War had a feeling of personal responsibility, and where they made was not up to standard. It was my experience that, as a rule, it was due only to the lack of knowledge of the proper process. In the Civil War, the government did not require, as compared to today, vast quantities of supplies. And as war then was not very intricate affair as it since has become, these supplies called for comparatively few new processes, and did not make a great strain upon the nation. Even the limiting manufacturing resources of that time had by no means to turn wholly to war. So supplying the government was more or less an affair of those who chose to undertake that sort of work. Army contracting became a business of itself. Many unprincipled men were attracted to it in the hope of cheating the government, and some succeeded. It is particularly reprehensible for men deliberately and shamelessly to profiteer at the expense of suffering humanity during the throes of war, but there were such, for whom the hangman's noose would be a fitting punishment. In some case, the contractors formed rings which included government inspectors, so it was practically impossible for an outsider to sell it all to the government. And it was possible for an insider to sell trash. He goes on to talk about how he tried to sell things for his own business and was unable because the rings had covered it. He's going to go on to meet many, many presidents. Lincoln was not a man who could hold a personal grudge, but it was different with President Johnson. I knew him slightly, and although I try to think well of everyone, I never, then or since, have been able to think well of him. He, too, had risen from a humble origin, but unlike Lincoln, had been narrowed instead of broadened by his experiences. Almost his first words as president were these: "The American people must be taught to know and understand that treason is a crime. It must not be regarded as a mere difference of political opinion. It must not be excused as an unsuccessful rebellion to be overlooked and forgotten." He sobered greatly with responsibility, but in the beginning he was very radical and was intent on the punishment of the South rather than on the betterment of the whole country. In this he was supported by many members of Congress who could not appreciate the larger view of Lincoln or General Grant. For Grant was a man who believed that a fight is a fight, and when it is over, it is over. Johnson's attitude created many clashes. One day I happened to be in Washington, stopped at the Willard Hotel. General Grant was sitting in the lobby. An aide rushed in and whispered something to him. Hurriedly, the general ran out, jumped on his horse, and galloped away. I knew that something unusual must be in the air and went over to the War Department to get the news from Stanton's secretary, as he said, his cousins there. They told me that a plan had been afoot to arrest General Robert E. Lee, and that General Grant, hearing of it, had gone at once to the President Johnson and informed him that Lee had surrendered to him at Appomattox Courthouse, and that he had there told him that he would not be disturbed at all. He was free to go ahead and help reconstruct his country. And therefore, so Grant informed the President, the Army was going to see that those terms were carried out, and intimated that if anyone attempted to disturb Lee, he would find himself under arrest. That, I believe, was the last of Johnson's idea of arresting Lee. And look, this is Farquhar's account. He writes about a lot of presidents, both Democrat and Republican. He's going to end up being one of the reason I came across Farquhar is that he was one of the campaign supporters, one of the business people supporting Grover Cleveland when he's getting the nomination again in 1892. So when I did that cast about Grover Cleveland's second unconsecutive term, and at that time he was the only president to do that, I mentioned Farquhar's name comes up, and I decided to look him up more. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
David Gardner here. For more than 30 years, I've been searching for the market's greatest rule breakers, the companies, ideas, and leaders that change the world and reward investors playing the long game all the way through. On Rule Breaker Investing, we go beyond the headlines and the hype to explore the mindset, the strategies, and stories behind truly transformational investing. If you're looking for hot tips, this may not be the show for you. But if you want to become a smarter, happier, richer investor and successful human being as well over time, join me every week on Rule Breaker Investing. Fool on.